Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules meeting on Thursday, October 5th, 2023. Get started. Have construction outside. Good timing. All right. Before we get started, we're missing some members here today, but we do have a quorum. We've got multiple meetings going on in the building, and so we have lots of people on this committee that are chairs of committees. I think a couple of them will be back at 11 o'clock for the fur rule after the other rules have gone through. We are starting that particular rule at 11 o'clock on the money, regardless of how the agenda goes today. And if we finish early, then we'll take a break until 11 o'clock. That's in deference to Senator Bray, who has a committee of jurisdiction regarding that particular rule, and want to give him the opportunity to participate fully in the conversation and discussion. So, the committee okay with that? Okay, great. All right, so let's get started. First order of business is the approval of minutes from September 21, 2023.
That motion.
Representative Bongart's motion to approve. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Motion passes. The first rule up today is 23P11, Cannabis Control Board Rule 1, licensing in cannabis establishments. But I think the same person that's presenting is also presenting 23P12, Rule 2, regulation of cannabis establishments, and 23P13, Rule 4, compliance and enforcement. We'll take them separately, vote separately. You're up. We have some construction sound posted in the background here, so speak up, please.
Yes, if you can't hear me, please just interrupt it. Good morning, Chair Squirrel and members. I'm Dave Gilman. I'm General Counsel from the Office, or I used to be from the Office of Professional Regulation. The old habits die hard. I am from the Cannabis Control Board, and I'm here before you on what is almost exactly the one-year anniversary of the opening of the regulated adult-use cannabis market with the board's first proposed amendments to its rules. As the chair had indicated, there are three, and we'll take them one by one, but they flow together. I'll start, of course, with the first one on the agenda. And Chair Squirrel, would you prefer that I begin with a kind of top to bottom fast walkthrough of what the amendments are, or would you rather that I launch right into receiving questions?
No, go for it.
Okay, I thank you for your time, and as I go, please interrupt at will if there's anything that I've glossed over or if you have questions. Turning to the first amendment, the definition of employee is actually recommended for removal from the rule for technical reasons. It was capturing the wrong things, and it was actually causing more confusion than the definition prevented. So the consensus on the board was that it would be best done without. The next amendment comes in the definitions at I, the definition of outdoor cultivation. This definition is amended to clarify that outdoor growers, somewhat counterintuitively, are permitted to use supplemental lighting. The reasons for allowing that really relate to the biology and the growth cycle of the plant. It's very hard, as far north as we are, to be an outdoor cultivator without using some supplemental light. Big help to the viability of those businesses to be able to do that. We are mindful, of course, that creates a somewhat different scene that doesn't always sit well with neighbors and whatnot. And so the allowable use of supplemental light is quite limited. But that lighting would be allowed under this amendment, subject to the restrictions there and subject, of course, to the nuisance rules and whatnot. There is, because it's classed as agriculture now under the statute, there is a presumption that it is not a nuisance. Nonetheless, a gross nuisance can be addressed by local officials. We hope not to ever get there, and we haven't had much fuss about that, but did want you to be aware that that amendment would have that effect of recognizing the use of supplemental light in outdoor growing. Moving to definition, the definition of social equity individual applicant in N of the definitions. These are really just clarifying amendments that are meant to accurately set expectations among licensees about who does and doesn't qualify, and to enable the board to be fair and consistent in the way it applies its definition. There have been, I think vagueness is nobody's friend when things like that are available. People don't know when they are eligible, and so we want to be crystal clear about what the requirements are and make them as objective as possible. So that is the effort there in the revision to the definition of social equity individual applicant. Similarly, the amendments to the definition of socially disadvantaged individual go again to the criteria by which one can qualify for certain discounts and reductions in fees and for certain business assistance intended for people who were disproportionately impacted by cannabis prohibition and people from communities that were. Turning next to 1.1.4, the applicability section, the new subsection B reflects the addition of authority for the board in statute to regulate the hemp-derived and synthetic cannabinoids. These are the kind of Delta 8 and Delta 10 mimetics that are often made and derived from hemp. And the board has authority and has used that authority in an emergency rule to protect the public from these kind of synthetic cannabis products. And this change to the applicability section just reflects that new statutory authority. Turning now to 1.3.3, the description of a tier 3 manufacturer is tweaked just slightly to explain that any extraction method reserved for tier 3 manufacturers must be in a building under the jurisdiction of the Division of Fire Safety. That translates to not a residence. To some of these extraction methods use flammable solvents, et cetera, that can be hazardous. And the idea there is that if fire safety hasn't seen the building and subjected it to the basic scrutiny that a public building receives for safety and fitness, it's probably not a prudent place to be using solvents of that type. But generally speaking, that would mean in a residence. The tier change rule 1.3.4 is really just amended for simplicity, little substantive change there. One of the more substantial for licensees changes is found in 1.4.5. Applicants no longer needed to document a bond or escrow for cessation of operations. Early in the market, there was concern that some folks would go under and not have the resources to, businesses do fail in a competitive marketplace. And the concern was that people might not have the resources to wind down their business responsibly and they leave a mess. And so the early rule required a $5,000 escrow be set aside by everybody in the marketplace so that if that happened, it was dedicated money to make sure that the business could be wound down responsibly. As it's turned out, the cost benefit on that rule really hasn't worked out. It worked a substantial barrier to people getting into the marketplace because there's another $5,000 in cash that you need to have to get in, and you have to park it. And it really wasn't helping anybody. It's turned out that on the rare occasions when people had to liquidate their businesses, they had valuable assets. It wasn't hard to distribute those to people interested in purchasing them and liquidating the business. And so this was hurting more than it was helping. And so the $5,000 escrow for cessation of operations would go away. Some of you may be aware of a separate escrow in lieu of insurance. That's going nowhere. That's still there for people who don't have insurance. But the wind down escrow, the $5,000, will free up a lot of cash for a lot of small business people in this marketplace. And as our experience was that it just wasn't doing the protective thing that we hoped, and it wasn't ultimately needed. Section 1.4.9 lists what are called positive impact criteria, sort of virtuous things a business can do, a licensee can do to be a good citizen. It's sort of a menu from which they're permitted to choose, and so you see some tinkering there with the requirements, most notably the requirement on at 1.4.9 now C little 3. Retailers could satisfy one of these criteria by assisting in paying the taxes applicable in the retail environment that would not be applicable to a registered medical patient getting cannabis at a dispensary. One of the challenges that we've had is the medical system was in place when the adult use system came into being. And there was a lot of concern among medical patients that they would be kind of left behind, that access would dwindle as people, look toward the more revenue producing adult use market. And so this is sort of an effort to mitigate that by making it inviting for retailers to provide access to medical patients in a way where the medical patients would not pay more out of pocket. So that's what you're seeing in that amendment. Well, you see amendments up to 1.7, almost all of those are non-substantive. In 1.9, you'll see the elimination of what were subsections B and E. These are having a plan to ensure 25% of cannabis flowers sold is obtained from Tier 1 cultivators, and a plan to contribute $50,000 to the Cannabis Business Development Fund by October 1, 2022. Those reflect the expiration of statutory startup initiatives. They were kind of one-time requirements that were set up by the General Assembly to fund the get up of the program. And so that's less a policy choice on the board's part than a reflection of the expiration of statutory collection events. Section 11 or 1.11.3 is the section governing who is qualified to hold the cannabis employee ID card. Those ID cards are required. They're sort of a lever that is used to ensure that everybody in the industry operating in the regulated industry has been appropriately background checked. The language change here is really just meant to provide a very clear and objective standard, so there's no question what test is the board applying when it looks at a criminal history. And so the effort that you see there by saying a person may be deemed qualified if the board finds that the licensure will not jeopardize the public health and safety or undermine the integrity of the legal cannabis market is just an articulation of what test is being applied so that folks know what standard they're being held to rather than having to kind of look across the room and see different people that may have different ideas of what qualifies. In section 1.14 or 1.15.1b, you'll see a sort of loophole closing that provides that non-receipt of a reminder to renew your license doesn't excuse you from knowing when the license expires. That's really just meant to ensure that we can enforce the rule against people who may forget to renew their licenses when they expire. The next substantive amendment recommended is at 1.17A1, providing that the board may waive the subsection its discretion. This is the subsection requiring reapplication for de minimis changes in control. What this means is that because the General Assembly is very interested when it created the program in making sure that large money interests couldn't monopolize the licenses, it included in the cannabis statutes a kind of one license of a type rule that says a person and the person's affiliates can only have one license of each type. The effort there being to avoid sort of monopolization. As a result of that, and as part of the board's duty to enforce that, the board collects more detailed than usual information about the ownership structure of these businesses. And it's pretty strict about requiring updates when things change, when a new stakeholder comes on board. The mechanism used to do that when there's a major change is literal reapplication, where the business will say, we're almost coming to you again with a completely new management structure, new individuals involved, and we'd like to be evaluated from top to bottom. What we had found is that there are certain de minimis changes of the type talked about here, where somebody who's just a very minor stakeholder comes and goes, where there's just no rationale for putting a business through that and having them give us that kind of detail. We don't need it. They don't need the paperwork. And so that's why there's that little out for de minimis changes that obviously don't implicate the more important statutory rule that one person and set of associates shouldn't be able to collect multiple licenses. And I think that's all of the really substantive amendments in Rule 1. I'd be happy to take any questions that you may have about the rule.
Representative Odie.
Thank you. I would like to hear as much as you can tell me about the use of artificial lighting in the early spring to lengthen the growing season.
Mm-hmm. I think my understanding, and the plant biology folks in my office roll their eyes at me, so I'm now regurgitating the tutorials they have attempted on me. But in order to prevent the plant flowering prematurely, in order to let it flower at an appropriate time when it actually yields the most for the grower, it is necessary in many cases to manage the life cycle of the plant by exposing it to artificial light, just in part because we're so far north.
So that's the economic reason. So can you address environmentally what that will do? Where will the lights be? How will the light being emitted be shielded from impacting species around it? Do they have any information?
Some. I mean, some of it is fairly vague in terms of how things would land on the ground, but I can talk to you a little bit about the environmental costs and benefits because there are both. The big benefit that the board sees in making it more viable to be an outdoor cultivator is that an outdoor cultivator, by comparison to an indoor cultivator, has a smaller environmental impact generally. And so if you can take somebody who would otherwise have to be classed as an indoor cultivator and have an indoor operation and enable that person to operate outdoors with the limited caveat that lighting would be involved, you've sort of done a net favor to the general environment in terms of impact, what size structure do you have, how much energy you're using, et cetera. So there's the benefit. I think the concern, which is a sort of a subpart of a larger conversation that's been going on since the inception of the regulated marketplace, is what if it's a nuisance to neighbors? Or what if the light is disruptive to flora and fauna around the facility? To that, I think I would emphasize first that the light emitted here is very limited. They're not allowed to just blast it. It's the minimum necessary to control the life cycle of the plant. And although there is a presumption, again, that operation of this type, because it's outdoor, is not a nuisance, it's just a presumption, and it can be overcome. So somebody who's doing something really odious with the light that is somehow still within the rule, and I don't think that's very likely, would still be reachable, at least technically, by local land use officials.
Could we put it in the rule now so that that nobody has to go through all that? Like how we could shield the light from hitting anything other than the plants generally?
Yes, I mean, the board does a lot through guidance as well as rule. And as you know, the substantive rules are meant to be put through this process and reviewed by the General Assembly, but the gaps are filled in by guidance, and with quite a bit of environmental guidance and best practices and recommendations to cultivators, and not spilling light all over, I think certainly will be one as we move into the new system. So,
to understand that more attention will be paid to the spillage of light by the board.
Yes, I think you can expect that board guidance will address what are best practices and expectations around using supplemental light if you're an outdoor cultivator. So it's a matter of interest to us in part because we want the folks involved to get along. We don't want town officials to see our licensees as nuisances, and we want to make sure that we're holding up the part of our mandate that has to do with environmental responsibility, responsible operation. So it is a trade-off in terms of, you're getting the benefit of more people being able to be outdoor rather than indoor, and that's good. You are creating some potential for friction or for gratuitous light exposure that I guess is inevitably it. I think the calculus is just that it's a pretty good trade-off in that, but it is a little bit of an experiment. We have to see how it unfolds.
All set?
You okay with that?
Representative.
Mr. Jim, thanks. I agree with some of your concerns, and I did reach out to Chair Pepper in regards to, you might have heard of the Charlotte incident of a grower over there that had some real issues. But I I was informed that that individual was out of compliance anyway. So again, I was assured as well that this limited light for the plants to grow they would do it by best practices and you know, it still is not going to prevent anybody from complaining in regards to one thing or another, but I felt confident that they would address it.
Thank you for saying that.
And so, so I hope that clarifies a little bit, and I would note that there is the May 1 cutoff, and this really should just be operating really at the shoulder, just in the twilight in the late months coming into May 1.
Any other questions? Entertain a motion.
Make a motion that we approve 23P11 Cannabis Control Board's Rule Number 1, licensing of cannabis establishments.
Just modifications.
Is there more? I'm sorry.
They had submitted some proposed modifications, very small ones.
We propose modifications submitted by the Cannabis Board on October 2nd, 2023.
There's a motion from Representative Higley. Any more discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion passes. Rule number 2.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So rule number 2 is where most of the action is because it's the operating rules. One were sort of the licensing rules. 2 are the substantive, how the housing establishment permitted to operate. So there's more meat to this one. It's a little bit longer to talk about. But if it's all right, I'll do the same thing, start at the top and give a quick summary, and please interrupt as I go if you have questions or if I haven't addressed something of interest to you. The scope and purpose section 2.1.2 is amended to reflect, as was the previous rule, the board's statutory authority over synthetic and hemp-derived cannabinoids. The definition of adulterated that you see at 2.1.3a is introduced there. It is a hybrid. It's important that concept be defined clearly because it is so broadly used in drug law, state and federal, and as well because the definition that you see here solves a problem and sort of works a compromise to a controversy that we'll discuss later in the rule about the permissibility of certain foodstuffs. One of the more challenging discussions that was had during rulemaking was about how many and what kind of novel or perishable foodstuffs can the board responsibly oversee, and which foodstuffs can be part of the regulated marketplace versus which are too unstable or difficult to manage to be part of the marketplace. So later on, it'll become evident why the clear definition of adulteration is important, especially the last subdivision 6 there, which is sort of a catch-all for anything that contains an additive or substance that may increase potency, toxicity, carcinogenicity, or addictive potential of the product, or that otherwise may present an enhanced risk to human health. So that catch-all made the board feel a lot better about liberalizing the rule about what foodstuffs were available, which we'll discuss later. Clone is defined, just for clarification, as is distillate, as is full spectrum. All of those really just for clarity. I don't think they introduce a substantive policy change. And we had some good input from industry on how best to define full spectrum, so the rules grab what they want, not what they don't. Harvest lot is redefined. This goes to a change in the testing protocols that is meant to improve the board's knowledge of the products and the board's understanding of registered products and the test results available from them, while maximizing the efficiency for cultivators. We want to test in units that are rational to get the benefit we want. If we test at too fine a grain, we really drive up people's expenses, and if we test at too large a grain, we miss stuff. And so defining harvest lot in this way is aimed at doing that, at calibrating kind of the right unit of attention in terms of testing analysis that we can discuss in the testing section. Isolate is defined. Outdoor cultivation is redefined in a manner consistent with the manner we discussed in Rule 1. The new definition of process lot also goes to clarity about the new testing requirements that will be discussed later. And you see a new definition of tincture. The applicability section is 2.1.4 is amended for technical reasons, really. 2.2.2a is amended very slightly to give the board a little bit of latitude to talk with the Department of Financial Regulation about what is commercially reasonable in terms of insurance. They're sort of the experts in that area. We started, but really didn't have an opportunity to finish during the rulemaking process, the conversation with them about maybe further defining commercial reasonableness. Because the concept is vague, it's hard for us to drive it down. If somebody comes in with something that would seem inadequate in terms of coverage, we can do it, but we feel better speaking with experts in the field and promulgating guidance that's a little bit more clear about expectations and criteria that would drive what is an appropriate level of coverage. The escrow section is also amended. This is 2.2.2 D, E, what are now D and E. To clarify that escrow means by definition that you can't put your hand into it without a third-party trustee. We had some confusion about that and folks just kind of setting aside money that one wouldn't really recognize as proper escrow, and we don't want that to happen. And similarly, the new subdivision E clarifies, basic expectations about what escrow means. It's only dispersed for specific purposes. 2.2.4 is where the real operating rules begin to be played with, and this is probably one that we should slow down and talk about carefully. 2.2.4b will call for cannabis establishments to develop recall procedures appropriate to ensure adulterated or dangerous product can be called back from the point of cultivation or manufacturing through efficient communication with downstream trading partners. That's sort of a mouthful, but what it means is keep track of who you sold to so that if something goes south and you need to, in order to protect public health, quickly notify everybody you sold to, you have a means of doing that. That's sort of a basic expectation in the pharmaceutical industry. And sort of borrowing that concept that if we have a healthy system, it ought to be possible to go to the source and say something has gone wrong, execute your plan that you already have in place to notify everybody promptly. And so that is sort of a cornerstone of the basic public health and safety issues, public health and safety considerations in the event of adulterated product. Doesn't happen often, but when it does, we need a fast way, and we need our licensees to have a plan already in place. We don't want them to be making that plan on the fly. In 2.2.4e, you see a new express prohibition on producing a product that contains any meat or meat products. Just below it in F, prohibition on producing a dairy product as defined in 6 VSA 2672. Folks sometimes ask, do our brownies have milk in them? Is a brownie a dairy product? No. The way the statute works is that the modification by baking would take it outside the definition. So it doesn't mean nothing that ever had milk in it. It means no liquid milk. And those limited the hopes of some manufacturers and were a subject of significant discussion during the rulemaking process. So I want to slow down and make sure that we're transparent with you about that and the reasons why you see what you do. The biggest is that because of the federal status of cannabis, the usual police on the beat, FDA, our Department of Agriculture, the USDA, are gone. They're not on the scene. They won't inspect your commercial kitchen. And we don't really have the capacity or the in-house knowledge to play FDA from where we sit or to play the Vermont Department of Health from where we sit. So for better or worse, that means that responsibility to the people we serve is just to say that we can't have those products in the regulated marketplace until those problems are resolved and there's some entity capable of overseeing the basic food safety issues. And there was a related issue in terms of avoiding inadvertent pediatric exposure to cannabis products. The more it looks like regular ice cream, the more it is susceptible to inadvertent exposure to children. So for all of those reasons, the board concluded that it's really best just to say that those classes of foods, really the perishables, those foods that wouldn't maintain shelf stability, can't be the base of the cannabis product. That doesn't mean that no novel foods are allowed. And so what you see in the subsequent amendments, these would be the new sections H and I, are opportunities for food purveyors to have their product tested for water activity and pH. Those are sort of the basics of the basic drivers of the stability of the food and its ability to remain sterile for a period of time. If it's more dry or if it's more acidic, just like you can leave a very acidic salad dressing out for a long time and it's fine, it may be safe. Whereas if it is less acidic or has sugars in it and quite a bit of moisture, it may be prone to spoilage much faster. So these are sort of incorporating the food safety principles that were recommended to us by the folks that we brought on board from the Department of Health and Agriculture. And articulating what tools to be used to define what foods are safe and what foods aren't. But it is quite possible you may have heard from constituents. I know folks who were hopeful about making ice creams and whatnot, and that wouldn't be allowed. And we just want to be transparent with you about that that's the case and why. Also see 2.2.4L, this is the very last subsection there. That requirement will provide that if a cannabis establishment is co-located in a residence or a building outside the jurisdiction of the Division of Fire Safety, which is virtually synonymous with a residence, they want to have in the area of regulated activity at least 2 operating smoke detectors or a number of operating smoke detectors at least equal in number to operating security cameras, whichever is greater. That sounds funny, but actually has a basic idea behind it. Some folks are doing very small scale cultivation in a residence. That involves the use of a lot more electricity and demand on the electrical system. It involves heat and light and water all together in the same place. And the sense is that especially if the Department of Fire, the Division of Fire Safety has not looked at the premises, we want to be able to know that there are basic fire safety measures in place there just because cultivation presents an enhanced risk of fire. So the hope is to ensure residential safety there for those buildings that DFS is looking at. The warning label section was the subject of this, and I apologize, I should have told you, 2.2.10, that's where I just jumped to, sorry about that. Addresses warning labels. There was a great deal of discussion around warning labels, and you may remember it from the inception of the market as well, between public health folks and industry about, sort of how do you boil it down to a little box and what's going to be said in that box. We discussed a lot during rulemaking about updates to these, and ultimately the board decided that those should be withdrawn. They didn't really seem to be improving things dramatically, and incremental changes in labeling are very expensive for producers. They've printed a lot of this stuff already, and so if the regulator says, well, we need different wording, throw it all out, that can be a several $1,000s problem for many manufacturers, and it wasn't seen to be the case that there was anything really wrong with the warnings as they were. There is a sense among the board and others, I think, that in time they are going to want to revisit these. There's a desire to use the standard ASTM symbol for cannabis, so that if you've seen the symbol in other states in the warning, it looks familiar to you. The same reason we want our road signs to look the same between the states. So those desires haven't gone away. Awareness of those policy considerations hasn't gone away, but it was the board's judgment that, and which was echoed by voluminous commentary, that the last thing you want to do in a new industry is do these things incrementally so that every 12 months everybody's got to throw out their labels. So, and that also buys us some time to have conversations with our colleagues at the Department of Health and folks in public health and safety to see kind of, what's most utilitarian to inform people here. We've only got so much space. We've only got so much of their attention. So you want to be really deliberate about how you use it and what you convey to them, and it pertains to the real risks. So that's why you saw a lot of talk, but not a lot in the commentary, but not a lot of changes in the actual labeling in the rule that you have before you. Rule 2.2.14 is amended really just for clarification by adding a sentence that clarifies that inspection may include uncompensated retention of product samples for laboratory analysis. That means that when our field agents go out and have reason to want to take a sample, they are not going to compensate the licensee. It's just sort of part of being licensed that you would provide a sample. That sample, of course, will be no larger than is absolutely necessary to achieve the laboratory testing necessary. But we didn't want any confusion about people sending us an invoice saying thank you for taking my product for sampling. So that's why you see that. The rule on co-location of establishments, 2.2.18, is amended very slightly just to provide that express board approval is required before two campus establishments co-locate for obvious reasons. We want to know where folks are before they go, not after we found them there. And so that clarifies that expectation. The amendment you see to 2.2.18C reflects the reality that the tier 6 is not open at this time. And so instead we refer to the largest open tier rather than tier 6. Uh, 2.2.18G also relates to co-location and clarifies that retailers may co-locate to the extent one retailer is providing mentorship or accelerator program for another. A big part of the hope in developing the marketplace was to allow folks who are new to the industry or who new to business to work with people with more experience and to sort of create a ladder into the industry. And this is further to that. There may be some circumstances where it's helpful to a new retailer to kind of co-locate with a mentor or accelerator, and that would make that possible. 2.2.19 addresses adulterated cannabis and cannabis product. The amendment to subsection A clarifies that all licensees shall make a prompt report to the board upon discovery of adulterated cannabis or cannabis product, regardless of cause or fault. What that's doing in operation is it's telling laboratories that discover dangerous conditions or dangerous product that they're relieved of having to decide whether to report because they have to. Because one can choose a laboratory, it puts them in a funny business position if it's discretionary. And we want them simply to tell us if something outside a parameter has come up, if they see an adulterated product. We'll sort it. Doesn't mean somebody's getting punished, but we want the information first, and we don't want them to be in an awkward business position. So everybody in the industry aware of adulteration tells us, and we'll sort it out. But the most important thing in terms of protecting the public is first we've got to know. Subsection C is meant to sort of give a little bit more structure and clarity to what happens in the event of adulteration. It is possible in some cases to undertake remediation, but after you've done that, retesting is required to make sure that the remediation was effective. And board guidance goes on about the details in which you can do that. The idea there, of course, we don't want to have undue waste, but we want the public protection of keeping adulterated product out of the marketplace. And that gives a little bit of structure for what to do if things go wrong in terms of the folks, with products on the market. So you see more about retesting there, and then what happens if remedial efforts are unsuccessful. The amendment that you see to 2.2.19C4 is really a workplace health and safety measure. Aspergillus can be hazardous to people who may inhale it who are working in the industry. They're entitled to know that the product is tested for it. And so the idea is that label needs to move with the stuff if it's going around so that people unaware are not exposed.
If I may, I'm getting a little concerned about time in our agenda. and I know you have another rule, but it probably won't take as long. We want to hear what changes you're making, but maybe you can hit the highlights.
Okay, I would be happy to. I'm sorry. I think if we're getting deep into the weeds there, then I'll skip right ahead unless you have questions. Clarification about the one location rule. We treat it as one location as long as you're separated by no more than one other span. The school property account number or unit that's familiar to most people who do taxes. 2.3.9C has been amended to address competition samples. This is just a regulatory issue for us. People want to submit their product for judging in competitions and whatnot, and we needed to give them a mechanism by which they could do that. And so that's what you see in that amendment. In the manufacturing section, 2.6.3, there's an express prohibition on disposable vape pens or other disposable vaping devices. And then there's further description of what that is. That means if you throw out the battery, you can't do it. The board also tuned up in 2.6.6 some of the rules about samples that permitted giving of samples to employees so they're familiar with the products they're selling. There's more about samples at 2.8.8, but all for the reasons that I've already discussed, so I won't dive too much into that. Testing requirements are refined, really reflecting the board's experience over the past year. The hope is to make them a little simpler, make sure that the unit of attention is appropriate, not too large, not too small in terms of dividing up what is scrutinized. But that's why you see what you do about testing. 2.9.12, amended concerning remediation. 2.10.6, the duty to purchase from small cultivators is stricken from the rule because the statute is, the time has gone by, it's no longer needed. So the only thing that I want to slow down for is 2.1.7 or 2.17. 2.17 is the rule about synthetic and hemp-derived cannabinoids. It reflects a codification of the emergency rule that the board adopted in April to protect folks from those products. These, again, are the synthetic and mimetics. There's quite a bit of discussion in the industry and hemp purveyors about where the line should be here. I'm happy to take any questions you may have about why they landed where they did, but a lot of thought and care went into this, a lot of negotiation in terms of how do we get the protection we want without harming people's businesses unnecessarily. So happy to talk about that if you'd like, but I think I'm at the end of that one. Sorry for dragging on. I think I've
You're at the end of that?
reached the end, but I have to, sorry to take so long.
Committee question. Not hearing any? Your motion?
Would approve 23B12, rule number 2, regulation of cannabis establishments with proposed modifications submitted by the Cannabis Control Board on October 2nd.
Additional discussion? All those in favor of the motion? Senator McDonald? Aye?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, thank you. One more.
This one's so short. So thank you, Mr. Chair. This one will be much shorter because there are only two changes. This is the board's proposed Rule 4 concerning compliance and enforcement. The substantive changes, there are some that don't bear getting into. The most important of those is that Rule 4.5.2 concerning Category 2 violations expressly prohibits altering, manipulating, falsifying a certificate of analysis. This is sort of the test result sheet that goes out to the consumer and that goes out to us. So understandable why we wouldn't want that to be permitted. A really technical amendment to 4.13A, clarifying that a party to a contested case may appeal a final decision of the Cannabis Control Board. The Administrative Procedure Act defines a contested case as one in which a person has a statutory hearing right or a constitutional hearing right. The reason for that technical amendment is in a literal sense, if we didn't make it, somebody could take us to the Supreme Court about what color the walls were. And we want only, we want only contested case decisions to be regarded as final decisions for purposes of appeal. And that concludes the proposed amendments to Rule 4.
Any question? Hearing none? Motion?
I'll move approval of 23-P13, Cannabis Control Board Rule 4, submitted to us, submitted to the council on August 22nd, 2023.
Okay, we have a motion from Representative Bongartz to approve Rule 23P13. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, appreciate your time this morning. Thank you.
Next up is 23E09. And we have Lauren Lehman going to present. And this is the Office of Professional Regulation, Emergency Administrative Rules for Notaries, Public and Remote Notarization.
Morning all. I'm Lauren Lehman, General Counsel with the Office of Professional Regulation. I have a request and good news this morning. I have a request and good news this morning. We are back. I am back to ask for one more extension of the emergency rules for notaries public. As you know, we adopted these in 2020. As the laws for notaries public have changed every year, so we have tried to keep this emergency rule for remote notarization going because the industries have become reliant on it. We just got authorization in summer 2022 to draft rules for remote notaries. We now have draft rules. We have to undertake the rulemaking process, though. We want to make sure folks have a chance to view them, provide stakeholders have input opportunities, and that we do a fair rulemaking process. So we need one more extension till March. Between now and then, we have we'll do the rulemaking, the comment, the public review, and so today I asked to grant us that extension so we can do a good job at getting these rules that we now have a draft of.
Ready?
Motion.
I just want to make a comment. At the last meeting we had an emergency rule from the Department of Health. I'm sorry, you're not hearing me. People are leaning forward. We had an emergency rule from the Department of Health that we felt was sort of an easy way to go about not doing permanent rulemaking. And I understand that there are mitigating circumstances again, because I know when you came before this committee in April of this year, there was comments in there that permanent rulemaking would be available to this committee next go around. I understand there were issues, not the least flooding. So, but I did want to make that statement because we're seeing a little bit of this emergency rulemaking being used as a way to move rulemaking forward as opposed to permanent rulemaking. So not about you specifically, just wanted to make that comment.
May I respond?
Thank you very much. Any questions, comments? Okay. Motion?
I move that we grant the Office of Professional Regulations request for an extension of its 8-month adoption.
Different rule. Oh, you jumped ahead of me, Jeff.
I jumped ahead. Okay.
Yeah, this is
Just
23 E09.
22P26.
23 E09.
E09, not P09.
It won't be in there. You're just moving approval of the rule.
I move approval of it.
We have a motion on the table from Representative Bodie. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed?
It's out of order.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. And next up, we have 23P09, which is Department of Public Safety, 22 Vermont Residential Rental Housing Health and Safety Code. And speaking for the department is Robert, is it Spoonable?
Spawnable. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine.
Great. My name's Robert Sponable. I'm the Deputy Director for the Division of Fire Safety. And the rules before you are for the Residential Rental Housing Health and Safety Code. The body of the rules are exactly what has been used for years through the Health Department. Through Act 181, we have been given the responsibility to start overseeing the complaint side of those rules. And so the rules that you see in front of you, we simply added our cover page, an introduction, a little description of what the scope of the rules are. And then we added our geographic map and an index in our office contact information on the back page. So there was no changes to the body of the language. It's just a matter of us transferring that over to us and putting our touch on it with our contact information.
Thank you. Committee members, questions?
Just that it looks like an easy one, that it's just a transfer from one group to another. So I move that we approve 23P09, Department of Public Safety, Division of Fire and Safety, 2022 Vermont Residential Housing, Health and Safety Code.
Okay, there's a motion from Representative Higley to approve 23P09. Discussion?
Transferring the responsibility from one to another, has the appropriation that pays for the supervision, inspection, et cetera, also being transferred?
Senator, I'm not quite sure about that. I know that as part of Act 181, we had the ability to hire or create four or five more positions for this. But as far as the actual running of the program, I don't believe so. But that is a question that I could certainly come back and advise you on that.
If we vote today, why would you need to come back?
Well, no, I'm just saying that if you want the information as far as the budgeting and whatnot like that, I can present that back to the board.
Mr. Chair, this is an unusual request that we transfer the workload and the costs from one department of government to another because you asked us to. Usually Appropriations Committee and Health and Welfare Committee would be taking a look at this. I must be missing something.
It's already happened. It was done in session law most recently in 2022, Acts and Resolves number 181. And I cannot substantively speak to it. But I will say in section 2 of that act, it says the Department of Public Safety is authorized to create 5 full-time classified inspector positions in order to conduct rental housing, health, and safety inspections and enforcement. Under the moved chapter, the department may hire the inspectors authorized by the section with funds appropriated for that purpose in this act. And then it's pulling the language on the rental housing safety inspection from Title 18. And then I think we are eventually going to get to an appropriation section. In terms of the transition provisions, it talks about how the rules can be immediately adopted, incorporated in the rental housing code under 3VSA Chapter 25. So it's putting in session law the transfer of those rules. And then you're getting your appropriation in section 8. $400,000 to the Department of Public Safety to hire 1 or more inspector positions. $20 million to the Department of Housing and Community Development to implement the Vermont rental housing. Oh wait, that's a different thing. Yes, I think you're getting that $400,000 to cover the inspectors.
Mr. Chair, I am reassured.
And so it's already included in session law in the packet.
That it has in fact been considered and part of the proposed rules carrying out
Yeah,
statute.
so this wasn't their idea, this was your idea.
Yeah.
You being the generalist.
Very good.
We have very capable ledge counsel.
Thank you.
Damien, if you're listening, correct me if I got that wrong.
Good job, Charlie.
So there's a motion on the table to approve 23-B09. Any more discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion passed.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have two motions, request for extension of adoption deadline. Is Lauren here? Okay. Maybe just give us a brief description of what the issue is. This is regarding 22P26 and 22P27, which I believe was at our last meeting that we approved.
So in that last meeting, there's a memo issued afterwards that said that we had to September 28th to file the final paperwork. I missed that date. I'm so sorry. I didn't see it. I thought we still had normal rulemaking time to file the adopted paperwork. So I have the paperwork ready. It's going to get filed as soon as the secretary signs it. I'd like to just have an extension so we don't have to redo these rules. And I'm so sorry I didn't see the date in the memo.
Okay. Questions, comments? I entertain a motion. We'll take the first one, P26.
Want a motion to approve the 8-month adoption deadline extension for 22P26 of the professional regulation administrative rules on alternative preparatory paths for funeral directors and embalmers.
And the October 11, 2023, right?
Yes.
Okay. We have a motion from Representative Bigley. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. 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 Opposed? And then we have 22P27, which I assume is the same issue. Do I have a motion?
Move. Okay.
With the October 11th, 2022.
Correct.
Okay, 23, sorry. Any discussion? Those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Thank you. You're awesome.
You're awesome. I appreciate it.
We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we'll be taking up 23P15.
Okay. Yeah, totally.
We'll see. Okay, so now we're taking up 23P15, Department of Fish and Wildlife, 10 Venus A, Appendix 40, fur-bearing species. We weren't successful. And I'd like to make a few comments before we get started, turn it over to the department. Want everyone to understand that we'll be taking this rule up over 2 meetings at a minimum, today and October 19th. And we'll go from there. Part of that was driven by the complexity and the challenges around the rulemaking, and also prompted by discussion between the committee's ledge counsel and our subject matter experts, ledge counsel Michael O'Grady, with the department about some concerns that they raised and wanting to give the department the opportunity to respond to those concerns. And the department indicated that they would attempt to respond to that. And we don't know what that's going to be, but we wanted to make sure the time was there. And the department gave us an extension in our opinion this up through at least our October 19th meeting. We'll have a presentation from the department. We have a list of witnesses. And I do want to respond to the last couple of days, committee members and other folks in the legislature received a significant number of emails suggesting that somehow this committee and our process is not above board. I guess it's the best way for me to say that. And that it's a one-sided process in terms, you look at the agenda, you look at the folks that are on the agenda. It's important to note that our requirement is to review the rule, and we request that obviously the department is here to present the rule. No one on this committee and none of the staff solicit testimony from anyone. We have a process where you can sign up and be put on the agenda to provide that testimony. And that's why these folks are here offering their testimony today. If other groups wish to do the same thing, I suggest that they be in touch with our committee assistant for October 19th, and they'll be given the same consideration as the folks that are on the agenda today. I just wanted to speak to that. Catherine, the floor is all yours.
Good morning. For the record, I'm Catherine Gessing. I am General Counsel for the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I'm here on behalf of the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Board to talk to you about the fur-bearing rules. I would like to just take a moment to introduce some of the staff who are here, some of whom are here in part to help me answer questions, because I am not the subject matter expert. I'm not a biologist. And so very quickly, we have Commissioner Christopher Herrick, Wildlife Management Manager David Sawsville, our former fur bearer biologist Kim Royer, our current fur bearer biologist Bree Furfay, Warden Mike Scott, who is going to help me walk through parts of the trapping rule, and Project Coordinator Chris Saunders. Act 159 directed the board to adopt rules based in large part on best management practices that were promulgated by the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And why trust these best management practices? Why trust the association? The association represents almost every state fish and wildlife agency in the United States, along with a whole host of federal entities, including EPA, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, and a number of non-governmental organizations and Canadian resource agencies. Its mission is to facilitate the management of fish and wildlife as public trust resources for current and future generations. It works on a lot of cross-cutting issues such as climate change and funding and conservation plans and international relations related to fish and wildlife conservation. The association conducted a decades-long study of over 600 trap types and 23 different fur-bearing species. It was a study that was based on standards developed by the International Organization for Standardization, which is standards that are used for many products like car seats and things like that. So it's a well-accepted standard. It was peer-reviewed and it was published in the Wildlife Graph, in 2021. That means that it was subjected to intense, independent review by qualified experts. And the monograph, by the way, is the gold standard for wildlife management science. So the legislature got it right when they directed us to do this. Nonetheless, there has been testimony before the legislature already that AFWA is a marketing entity, that every single Fish and Wildlife agency in the United States is biased, that we are gaslighting the public and you, and that the study that was performed by AFWA is biased as well. Of course, it is a given that people could have real concerns about trapping and the trapping rules on both sides of the issue. And there's a lot of passion on both sides of the issue. But it is undeniable that the AFWA study on BMPs is based on empirical information, and that AFWA is a science-based organization. This is a study that is not anecdotal or conjectural. So with that, I'm going to ask Warden Mike Scott to just walk through some portions of the rule that apply the best management practices to trapping in Vermont, because I think that it's much easier to understand why these techniques are going to work and assure effectiveness, selectivity, and more humane results. And he's going to talk about sections of the rule that are on page 3 and 4 of the markup. They are 4.5, 4.6, and 4.7. And they relate to foothold traps, body gripping or kill traps, and bait. And I'll just turn it over to him briefly.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair.
Sorry, Senator Bray.
Good to see you. Thanks for coming
Nice
over.
to see you.
Can I just, before you go on with the presentation, I don't want to interrupt. I just want to check in on the sort of past. My understanding is that you've had conversations with legislative council and that there are visions being considered. I don't know if we're going to see those today or they're going to be brought forward after this meeting. So I'm just trying to have a sense of what we'll review on sort of what time. Is that something you can help us with?
I can, essentially what I'm going to do is primarily walk you through the rule as it's presented today. I will touch on some of the topics that are in the memorandum as council shared with us, and thank you for that. It was helpful to get that ahead of time.
Sure.
But we do have to go back to the Fish and Wildlife Board, and so those sort of discussions, need to happen. before we can,
And maybe before we wrap up today, we can, if I may, revisit the timeline, just so that members of Lcar will know how this might unfold over time.
all right, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Morning. I appreciate your patience. My name is Mike Scott. I'm a senior state game warden. I've been employed by the Department of Fish and Wildlife as a game warden for approximately 10 years. I'm here today to present section 4.5 of this rule, specifically relating to the hardware that is used to trap fur bearing animals. Our existing regulations don't provide much guidance in terms of what traps can and cannot be used, which features those traps should have. The BMP process evaluated individual traps against individual species and provided very specific recommendations in terms of which traps and which methods should be used to capture these species. It is a complex series of documents for each species of wildlife. And Vermont, to my knowledge, is the first state attempting to boil down these BMP recommendations, which were never intended to be regulatory, into a set of regulations that is clear, concise, and enforceable. It's a challenging task. The working group that met identified key features of traps that would make these traps more humane, more selective, and safer for the general public. And what I'm going to show you today is some of those features as they are recommended in this rule. Section 4.5 starts off talking about a center-mounted chain. So if you look at this trap, this is a foothold trap. The chain is mounted at the center of the base plate, which is the bottom metal part of this trap. Not always been the way traps were attached to a chaining system. If you look at this trap, the chain extends off of the side of the trap, off of one of the springs. Now, the reason that a center-mounted chain is more humane is that when an animal is caught in the trap stays centered on the animal's paw. Whereas if a trap is side chained, when the animal is caught and it pulls against the trap, the animal's paw will tend to slide to the corner. Okay. What that does is it leaves an opportunity for abrasion as the trap and the foot slide against each other. And also there's the opportunity for pinching in the corners of the trap. By requiring a center-mounted chain setup, such as this, the animal's paw stays centered, and as the animal pulls against the chain, the foot does not move to the corners of the trap. The rule requires swiveling at a base plate. So this trap is also center mounted, and it has a swivel placed at the base plate. And again, partway down the chain, there's two more swivel points. These are swivel points right here. Why is that important? So a chain without any swivels can bind very quickly. So if you take this chain, an old-fashioned style chain without swivels in it, and you rotate it, within 2 rotations, the chain starts to bind. Within 3 rotations, it's essentially not going to allow the animal to move at all. Whereas a well-swivel trap, this trap has 4 swivels in line, the trap can swivel indefinitely without binding the chain. What does that mean for the animal in the trap? It means that an animal caught in this trap does not suffer joint damage when the trap fails to rotate once the chain is bound up. So the more the trap can move with the animal, the more humane the trap is for the animal because there's less joint damage. This has been shown repeatedly. Trap swivels are really a standard in the industry, and having trap swivels without question makes the trap a more humane device. The rule proposes to have a trap chain length between 12 and 18 inches to the anchoring system. So the anchoring system on this trap starts at the base plate and would go down to here. That's approximately 12 inches to the end of the swivel. All right. If you have a minimum of 12 inches and a maximum of 18 inches to the ground, this animal is allowed freedom of movement once it's in the trap, but not so much movement that the animal can run to the end of a chain and come to a sudden stop. Within this trapping system, you could add shock springs into this and additional swivels. However, the entire above ground portion of the trap chain system still cannot exceed 18 inches. The BMP process evaluated traps using traps that were solidly anchored into the ground, using trap chain systems such as this. A technique that has been commonly used is something called a drag, and this would no longer be permitted as part of this rulemaking process. A drag was intended to allow an animal to be caught in a trap and then move to the cover of brush where an animal feels more secure. However, this would no longer be allowed under the rules as proposed. They would have to be solidly anchored. The trap jaw design is a feature that is subject to change. So all these orange traps up here would no longer be permitted for one reason or another under these rules. These are called closed jaw traps. And under the rule, these style traps could no longer be set on land. Traps would have to be either offset. You see the gap in between there? They would have to be offset. It would have to be cast or thickened. So if you can see inside these jaws are extra thick. These are 5/16 of an inch thick jaws. They would have to be padded. So this trap actually has rubber pads on the jaws. Okay. Or they would have to be laminated, which is a way of increasing the thickness of the trap jaws by welding bars on either the tops or bottom sides of the jaws. And what this does is it increases the surface area of the trap that's in contact with the animal's paw. When you increase the surface area of the trap jaws, you're going to decrease the pounds per square inch of pressure on the animal's foot. So, I'll go through this again. This is an offset trap with cast jaws that are 5/16 of an inch thick. This will permit additional blood flow to an animal's foot. This is the padded jaw style that uses rubber jaw pads. This trap is offset. And then the additional style to use a trap such as this, but laminate metal bars on top or on bottom of these jaws to increase the surface thickness of the jaw. These regular style jaws, as they're known, these closed jaws would no longer be permitted for traps set on land. The other trap style that is in the same family is called an encapsulating foot trap. These are commonly known as dog-proof traps. And the animal, because the foot is also fully encapsulated in here, this is also on the approved list. It's a highly selective trap towards raccoons. The next feature is jaw spread. So when a trap is set, the maximum jaw spread measured in any direction would no longer be allowed to exceed 6 1/4 inches. So this trap, the jaw spread is less than 6 1/4 inches and would still be okay to set on land. Some of these larger traps, this trap has a jaw spread that's approaching 8 inches. I think it's 7 3/4 inches. Would no longer be allowed to be set on land, even if the other jaw style features were met, because it does not. It's greater than 6 1/4 inches. And why 6 1/4 inches? That's not an arbitrary number. The BMP documents review individual traps, and for the suite of species that we have in Vermont, there are virtually no examples where a trap with a jaw spread greater than 6 1/4 inches would pass the BMP evaluation process for the suite of species that we have. In other parts of the country where they have wolves, a larger trap would be justified. But here in Vermont, where our largest animal is a coyote, traps larger than 6 1/4 inches simply would not pass the BMP process. The last feature in foothold traps would be the ability to adjust hand tension. So if you look at a trap such as this, there is a bolt right here that can be tightened down. And what that does is it allows this pan to have a varying degree of force required to set the trap off. See this right here. A large animal exerts a pretty significant amount of pressure on each foot when it steps on a trap. And by adjusting the pan tension, you can exclude lighter weight animals and birds from setting these traps off simply by adjusting that pan tension screw tighter. So traps would be required to have some mechanism for adjusting pan tension, which is key to selectivity in trapping. Moving on to section 4.6, which is requirements for body gripping traps. This is the second main style of trap used today. This is called a body gripping trap, also known as a rotating jaw trap. So the spring is compressed, the trap is set like this, and this is how it looks when it's set. The animal that you're targeting moves through here and presses the trigger and is caught between the jaws. It functions very much like a large mouse trap. Section 4.6 states that traps of this style, when set on land, cannot exceed 40 inches if there's any sort of bait involved. So traps smaller than 40 square inches of jaw opening can be set on the ground with no bait. Right. For measure, this trap is roughly a 4.5 by 4.5 inch trap. So a 40 square inch trap is slightly larger than this, but it's the same idea. Traps between 40 and 60 square inches of jaw opening would include traps such as this. Can only be set if they are 5 feet off the ground or greater, or in an exclusion device, which I'll describe here in a moment. An example of how these traps are set 5 feet off the ground and what that looks like is a leaning pole set. This is a common set used to target animals such as fisher. And you take a leaning pole and you support it up in the air somehow. The animal has to climb from the pole and go through the trap on its way to accessing bait, which is concealed up underneath these branches up here. So just for a visual, that's what 5 feet off the ground looks like. The other method, which would still be acceptable, place these same traps inside of an exclusion device with an opening not greater than 60 square inches. So inside of this box, you'll see that there is a body gripping trap just like the one that's on the pole up there. It is between 40 and 60 square inches of space of jaw spread. The trap trigger has to be recessed at least 12 inches from the opening. So the trap trigger is in line with these springs. So the trap would have to be recessed at least 12 inches from the opening. The cubby exclusion device box would have to be stakeable, so it can be staked down to the ground. So there's a hole in the box here that you can push a rebar stake down to the ground, so animals can't flip this thing around and shake the trap out. And then once again, the opening of the box, this opening here cannot exclude 60 square inches, and that is 60 square inches approximately at the opening. Traps larger than 60 square inches will be prohibited from being set on land and can only be set in the water. This is what they are commonly called a 330 style trap. It is nominally 10 inches by 10 inches and is too large under existing law to be set on land. It can only be set in the water. And then traps that are smaller than this, up down to 60 square inches, also be prohibited. The exclusion device, like the one I just showed you, doesn't have to be made out of wood. They can be made out of wood, plastic, wire mesh. There's a variety of methods for constructing those. Section 4.7 speaks to meat-based bait. The rule will prohibit or require any trapper using a meat-based bait to cover that meat-based bait at the time the trap is set. In the example of the leaning pole set here, that would mean when the trap is set and baited, the bait would have to go underneath this brush here to prevent birds, which are primarily sight feeders, from recognizing that bait and being attracted to the set. This also goes for the use of foothold traps, which are commonly baited with meat-based baits. Any meat-based bait used in conjunction with a foothold trap would also have to be concealed, either with materials such as leaves, dirt, snow, soil, sticks and leaves, or it could also be contained inside of something like a wire exclusion. So in this case, a trap would be set inside this opening here, and the bait would be upside in the inside here. That way, birds and such could not access it. And the trap would be recessed inside of this. Just in conclusion of my portion of this presentation, the requirements that I have described to you are entirely new. We do not currently have these codified in law anywhere. So by improving these regulations, all of these features serve to enhance the selectivity and the humaneness of the traps that we are currently using to trap fur-bearing animals. And I firmly believe that every step, every portion of this contributes to both the humaneness and the selectivity. Thank you.
Committee members, any questions on this portion?
Mike? The next section of the rule that I just want to touch on briefly because it was mentioned in the memorandum from Ledge Council was, I think it was 4.13, where the rule, this is on page 4, the rule sort of it crosses off poisonous mixtures and it substitutes explosives. There was a comment that chemicals and poisonous mixtures may actually be different qualities. And this, I think, is something that could potentially easily be fixed and addressed, tweaked. I think this was a change that happened after 10 o'clock at night at the board meeting when everybody was getting a little bit punchy. And so if we're able to go back to the board, we can potentially make a proposal on that one. The other one that was.
If I may also, with these proposed changes, the timeline's going to be important to us also, going back to Senator Bray's question, right? In terms of understanding what.
Yeah, we do have a board meeting on, is it the 16th? The 18th, October 18th. So that is a little tight in terms of the 19th, the meeting on the 19th. So we'll have to see if we can.
I understand that,
Yeah.
just so we have some time.
Yeah. Okay. The other comment relating to trapping had to do with the reporting, which was in 4.23. There was a change to the biological collection section, and that could just be clarified. We have a there's a statutory provision which requires all trappers who catch pets to report directly to wardens. We can put that in the rule to make it clearer. And then there's also a trapper survey that trappers have to fill out. And it includes reporting on incidental traps of animals other than the target animals. So it's pretty comprehensive, and we can just kind of put in clarifying language, assuming. So the next thing that I wanted to touch on were setbacks. This is a section that was flagged by Legislative Council as not meeting legislative intent. The sections of the rule that are relevant to setbacks are in both the definitions related to legal trail, public highway, public trail, that's on page 2. And then 4.15, which is on page 4 of the rule, which sets forth the prohibition against placing a trap 50 feet within a public trail, a legal trail, and public highways. Public highways do include class 4 roads. The directive from Act 159 was that the board fashion requirements for the location of traps, including placing traps at a safe distance from public trails, class 4 roads, playgrounds, parks, and other public locations where persons may reasonably be expected to recreate. I'd like to just explain briefly the provision, the setback, and the rules as they stand now, because I don't think those portions would change. It would just be, if we went back to the board, it would just be some additional provisions. But both public highways and trails are defined in Title 19, Section 301. Legal trail is a term that we put into this rule to talk about municipal trails that are designated by municipalities. So those are often either a trail that they've designated on their own, or they might be an old road that's been thrown up that they've designated as a trail. Public highways include all state and town roads. Both of these, both legal trails and public highways, are mapped by VTrans. There's a website where you can go and look at highways for each municipality in the state. So they're very well defined. They are easily discoverable by both the public, and they're enforceable. There isn't necessarily a definitive definition of trail in Vermont law. We did define public trail for the purposes of the rule as a pedestrian footpath that is mapped and designated by a state agency. And we also, in this rule, exempted wildlife management areas and properties where folks were trapping on their own land. The rationale for these provisions was that I just wanted to add that that suite of trails covers about just over 17,000 miles around the state of Vermont. So part of the rationale for this is that there has been no reported incident of a member of the public either being caught or injured by a trap. So that leaves us with protecting pets and incidental animals. Incidents involving trapping and injury to domestic pets have been very low. The reports to the department, a survey of Vermont veterinarians that was conducted several years ago, the experience of department staff and UVM studying bobcats and coyotes, and the AQUA study itself show that this is a very low risk. And of course, it is tragic when and traumatic, I think, when a pet is caught or harmed. But the level of risk associated with trapping is low. 2 dogs were killed last year by traps. Both those incidents involved illegal trapping in violation of our rules. It is very likely that the risks associated with trapping are orders of magnitude less than risks associated with pets in car accidents, pets struck by vehicles, pets attacked by other animals, or pets, wildlife, including wildlife. Land trapping seasons in Vermont are between the 4th Saturday of October to December 31st. There are some trapping seasons that are shorter than that, but they're all within that window. Vermont state parks, of which there are about 51, are primarily closed during that time period. There are 3 exceptions: Little River State Park, Lowell Lake, and Salem Lodge. There is a trapping season for aquatic species, and that's between the 4th Saturday in October and March 31st. But there you're talking about traps that are underwater during a pretty cold time period of the year where people are not in the water. Trappers are required to have permission by Vermont statute to trap on private land. And that is 10 VSA 4707. They have to notify a landowner of the location of the trap, and a landowner can revoke permission to trap at any time. Municipalities and federal agencies also have the authority to control trapping activities on their properties. In speaking with some private trail organizations, which rely on private landowners for their trail networks, they're concerned about the imposition of additional requirements and their ability to maintain permission to maintain their trail networks on those properties.
I'm sorry, but could you repeat that? I missed the beginning.
Well, I'll give you an example. Organizations like VASA and VAST oftentimes rely on private property owners to connect their trails, particularly trails between, public land. Wildlife management areas were exempted from the setback requirement because those areas have been specifically purchased for the purpose of maintaining wildlife habitat, as well as facilitating wildlife-based recreation. So hunting, fishing, trapping, bird watching, et cetera. Part of the rationale, I believe, of the department and the board was that given the very low risk of trapping to incidental animals, including pets, and the potential imposition of requirements on private landowners and municipalities who may wish to control their own properties, the department and board landed on the provisions that are before you. We certainly want this rule to succeed. So I'm happy to take questions if people want to discuss this section, because I think this is the section that was identified specifically as not meeting legislative intent.
Committee members? Representative Odie?
So an example of an added requirement that's a concern or potential concern would be
The added requirement is the setback requirement. Yeah.
So once it's set, they are, what are they, what is the, all right, so there's a concern about the setback, about more than a 50 feet setback, or they're okay with the 50 feet or not okay with the 50 feet?
I think the concern is that, they ask people for permission to go onto their property and use the property for a trail network, and that if there are, restrictions that go along with that, some landowners may not be willing to allow them to continue to use that property.
So summary sentence on that would be? Sorry.
Trail networks that rely on private property owners to connect to have their recreational trails have concerns about additional restrictions on their lands.
Like the 50-foot setback?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Or whatever else it might be.
Or anything else. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to be sure I was
No.
clear on that.
That's fine.
If I may.
Yeah.
Back to wildlife management areas. I think the Ledge Council brought up an example of like Dead Creek, which is heavily used by folks other than hunters and trappers, if you will. A lot of recreational use. And could you explain to me why that would also be exempt?
I think part of our thinking was that, the wildlife management areas were specific, their primary uses in wildlife and the primary recreational uses in wildlife management areas are hunting, fishing, and trapping, and that we're reluctant to necessarily restrict that when, in fact, there has been no incident in any of those areas that has indicated that there's a problem.
That may be, but I submit to you that I think we're seeing more and more non-consumptive use of our wildlife management areas, and things change. And I would like to think that the board might take that into consideration.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Senator Bray.
Thank you. So the language in 159 includes this phrase at the end, and other public locations where persons may reasonably expected to recreate. I think in part going back to Representative Squirrel's question, I'm having, can you explain how it wouldn't surprise me that people would recreate in a wildlife management. I'll just stick to that one example, in a wildlife management area. But the language of the bill says that it should cover areas where they may reasonably be expected to recreate. So how did you parse that to exclude some areas? I mean, I know you just answered that way by saying that there hasn't been incidents, but the language of the law doesn't say based on a record of incidents or non-incidents. It just says where they may reasonably be expected to recreate. So I'm just trying to look at the plain language, see how you could decide to exclude an area. I don't honestly understand the exclusions.
Does anybody else want to jump in?
Do you want to, Dave? You go.
Yes, recently recreate.
Excuse me.
This is David Sosville.
Yes.
Sorry.
David Sosville, program manager in the wildlife management section. And I can put in there, I can answer questions about Dead Creek because I lived on site and managed that and 14 other WMAs for almost 15 years. So I have plenty of experience with the public of all types on those areas. So, but to reasonably recreate on a wildlife management area, recreation is dispersed. We don't concentrate our recreation on these wildlife management areas. We do provide parking areas. We don't develop trails for the most part. We have a few throughout the state, so we don't have trails on wildlife management areas. So I think that is another consideration. You're right, more people during the pandemic for sure started to use these areas. But I had 0 people come to me with being worried about and reporting any type of person being trapped. And on Dead Creek itself, I know of many trappers that were there and they used it annually. So it was not something that was of a concern for us and from experience on the ground. Did that answer your reasonable recreation expectations? I'm not sure, right? Because it's hard to define reasonably recreate where.
Yeah, well, I'll leave it at that. It just seems like it's reasonable that when there's a public space, that the public at large, cappers and non-cappers, might recreate there. And again, you know, I think I'm just looking at the simple phrase, you know, where persons may reasonably expect to recreate. It doesn't include a phrase about based on a history of risk or reports, whether someone was worried or unworried, or if someone inquired whether it was safe or unsafe to be there. I'm just sticking to the language as it is.
Catherine?
Yeah.
May I add to that, what David just said? Kim Royer. I'll just say that we manage wildlife management areas and forest and parks lands differently because of the funding sources. And as David said, we try to put our non-consumptive recreational activities as much as possible on our forest and parks lands. We put more trails there. We allow for more kinds of activities. And as David suggested, on our wildlife management areas, because we're concerned about impacts also from disturbance, year-round disturbance from people with dogs on our wildlife management areas, we try to limit, as David suggested, the trails that are there, so that we can encourage not just dispersed recreation and try to keep the recreation sort of more lightly dispersed across the landscape. We're not always successful at that, but that's sort of the difference in our mindset in terms of when we manage both sets of properties.
Sure. If I may.
I think, so, sorry, go ahead.
So I don't want to I don't know all the wildlife management areas, but for instance, Snake Mountain is kind of in my backyard and it has trails that are busy because it's a great hike.
And those trails,
and stuff like
those
that.
trails are actually mapped and designated by the state agents. I would say that some of the trails or, you know, access roads, sort of management access roads that we have on wildlife management areas are not necessarily mapped and designated as trails, because they are intended to be that kind of dispersed use. But we do have some wildlife management areas that have very popular trails like Snake Mountain, where the definition of trail is applicable and they are mapped and designated by our department as trails.
Thank you, that's very helpful. And then here's a beginner question. So what's the relationship between the state and the national park, you know, national forest? I'm thinking like the Long Trail. How does this rule interact with lands that aren't direct? I don't know if you're like EPA or delegated authority to manage in those areas, or how it works? So what happens when you're on the long trail? And you're,
Well-
now you're on national forest land.
Right. The National Forest, the U.S. Forest Service has they actually have a pretty good website where they've kind of designated trails. They also have independent authority to control, what kinds of activities occur on their properties, including trapping. So, the Long Trail is a great example because it goes through state public land and it's mapped and designated on state public land. But then when it goes onto federal land, they've mapped and designated it as well. But the way that this is drafted, we didn't necessarily include them. We didn't include them because we didn't include federal lands.
Do the feds defer to Vermont? Do they say whatever your local tracking?
Sometime.
Basic hunting conditions are,
Yeah.
they apply to our lands. We're gonna let local control rule on that.
It kind of depends. I mean, we have, there are federal lands where the regulations they're completely dependent on Vermont, state law. And then I think there's some U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service land where they have some slightly different regulations. They're more stringent than ours. And so they haven't necessarily deferred to us on everything. Does that answer your question?
Well, it's a start. I don't want to bog us down and take too much committee time. I'm just trying to.
Happy to have
parse
a longer
how the
conversation.
scope of where these rules should apply
Yeah.
is determined. I'm still learning.
Yeah.
If I may, want to do a time check here. We're close to the noon hour, and that was our scheduled end time for the meeting. I'm suggesting that maybe we go another 15 minutes, but I want us to look around the room, committee members and Dutch council and staff. No issue with that. And it is likely that, we're not going to get done, okay? There's a lot to be talked about and discussed here. And I apologize to everyone who signed up to be witnesses. We'll have to defer to probably the next meeting, because I don't think we'll get to additional witnesses today. Again, my apologies. We'll assume that you do want to be on the next agenda, and that's what we'll do. The other thing also to council of department, you have a document from our staff, Pledge Council, and also Michael O'Grady, which raised questions and pointed out some areas where we're thinking that, not sure if it just meets legislative intent, those kinds of things, even if they weren't framed as a question. Right? I'm asking you and your staff if you wouldn't respond to this memo in written form so that we have something to look at prior to the next meeting. And I think it'll help the process move forward too, if you could do that.
Commissioner? Sorry.
No. Okay.
Did you
That
do
didn't
that?
sound like a question more
Oh,
as a request.
yes.
That's a request.
That's a request.
That's a request. I think that would be useful. Some of us are more this issue than others, and I think
Sure.
it would be useful. And I think in the context of being as efficient as possible in terms of committee and your work, I think that'll help.
And we can,
Thank you. Appreciate that.
thank you.
Please continue in your 15 minutes.
Okay, so hopefully I'll finish up the trapping at least.
Okay.
One of the other sort of directives that was in Act 159 is that we had to provide for dispatch of trapped animals that is consistent. So we came up with a provision of the rule that is in section 4.16. It starts on page 4 and it goes into page 5. Essentially what we came up with is that upon discovery, a trapper shall immediately dispatch a live trapped fur bear with a muzzle loader or gun held at arm's length, a crossbow or a bow and arrow. And one of the things that we really had hoped would happen before we promulgated the rule is that the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies would make specific recommendations about humane dispatch. That did not happen, so we put a provision in the rule that essentially says that we'll come back and reconsider, come back and do rulemaking, when we get those recommendations. And the last thing that I wanted to just touch on very briefly was a survey that the department conducted in the fall of last year by a company called Responsive Management. This is a company that has worked for a whole bunch of state agencies and the Department of Interior, as well as Stanford and Yale universities and some NGOs like the Sierra Club and the Environmental Defense Fund. They conduct statistically accurate surveys of, citizens' attitudes towards whatever the subject matter is. And they conducted a survey which is statistically representative of the Vermont's residents' population. The results of that survey showed that the majority of Vermonters, over 60%, 63% are either highly or moderately satisfied with the department. And the knowledge about the department increased the satisfaction rate. Most residents also said that the department was very credible. This was a survey about fur bearers and fur bearer management. There was a question that asked whether Vermonters support regulated trapping. Overall, 60% of residents either strongly or moderately supported regulated trapping. 10% didn't know, 29% disapproved of it. Knowledge about kind of the rationale and the reasons for trapping was pretty variable. There was a question that specifically asked, like, whether you approve of trapping for different kinds of reasons. So, for example, 91% of Vermonters strongly or moderately approve of trapping for relocating wildlife or restoring wildlife populations. That's something that's happened in the past in Vermont. And 70% approved to reduce damage to crops and gardens. In contrast, only 26% of Vermonters indicated that they approve of trapping for recreation. But I did include a link to the survey in the package. I encourage you to go and look at it because the context of the entire survey is important. There was a question that said, regardless of your personal opinions about trapping, would you support banning the right of somebody else to trap? And 60% of Vermonters said no. So that says to me, kind of the Vermont that I know and love, pretty tolerant of other people and their activities, says to me that most people would support trapping. The other thing is that, the reasons why people trap are not always easily identifiable into one category. Most trappers trap during the season, and they use the fur, they eat the meat. Trapping is crucial to wildlife management, and it has been a source of credible and important information that the department uses to monitor wildlife populations, their abundance, and their health. And here I'm really just talking about fur bearers. It ensures that these resources are used responsibly, and provides some relief to the public from damage situations. So I will leave it at that unless anybody wants to add anything else. Any questions?
Committee members? Senator Bright?
Maybe in part of the information you'll gather for next meeting. Could you, and just like to better understand in what way the role that trapping plays in management of any species or members of disease or something like that. I know they're used for research, but I'm not, I'd like to learn more.
Sure.
About, for what species they're used to manage numbers or.
I'll give you one example now, but I'm sure that biological staff will have some better ones. We do use trapping to protect certain threatened and endangered species. So for example, spiny soft-shelled turtle, when they're nesting and the turtles come out of the nest and they're on their way to the water, there can be some significant predation by things like raccoons and other, animals that will eat these little tiny turtles. So we use trapping to ensure that that species can kind of continue to procreate and successfully.
Sure. Yeah. I'm not doubting it. I'm just trying to understand. So if you could elaborate on, and I want to also be careful to distinguish. I'm not talking about nuisance trapping where it's like, we have to manage a species because these beavers built a dam that then clogged a culvert, that then flooded a road, that kind of municipalities get into that.
Yeah.
I see that Commissioner Herrick would like to.
For the record, Chris Herrick, Commissioner of Fish and Wildlife. Senator Brown, I just want to clarify. I think what you're asking for is the scientific benefit of trapping. And I've got staff who can write hundreds of pages on that. So we will have information for you supporting that.
Okay. Representative Odie?
I'd like to know about, a question that came to my mind is in forests and in parks, you have non-consumptive use that you're hoping to have there, concentrated more there. And then in wildlife areas, you want to limit the amount of, or disperse the amount of action in those areas, like unfragmented forests. Would a dog be considered an invasive species in a wildlife area?
Well, certainly dogs and cats can be a threat to wildlife. They can chase them. There's a lot of information about cats in particular. There have been some really incredible studies about how many small mammals and birds they kill in the United States. It's billions, basically.
Right.
Go ahead.
Trying to add in something to that.
Yeah.
David saw, so. Let's say the difference you have to look at is a free roaming dog that is not under control, which is different than somebody that is training a dog or has them in control under voice or collar command. So I think that's something you have to make a distinction of when you're looking at it. They are going willy-nilly throughout the woods, possibly chasing wildlife at certain times of the year when you don't want them to, whereas a trained retriever or rabbit hound or something like that is being used during a time of year when there's abundant surplus. Also, they're trained on a particular species, and there's a complete difference between just a dog and a trained dog.
I have two dogs. I have a pit bull mix, and he's really, really good. He's right next to me. And he responds to voice control, but then I have a hound mix and I have to put her on the leash when I'm in the woods because she will chase anything that moves.
So my next question is, are there leash laws for dogs in the woods? And should there be?
Most leash laws are, in Vermont, come from municipalities. And so it really sort of runs the gamut, depends on what town you're in. There is no statewide standard or leash law, as far as I know.
No, we don't support a leash law like that.
And why would that be?
Oh, talking about leash laws.
Yeah, I think your response is correct.
Yeah.
Some municipalities allow voice control.
Yeah.
You all set, Representative Odie?
No, because you said, Commissioner, the
Yeah,
Commissioner.
we don't support a leash law on just lands like that. Maybe on forested parks, I don't know if they do or not. But on wildlife management areas, it makes no sense. Dogs can be used for training, dogs can be used for hunting.
But no leash laws for non-trained, non-hunting dogs.
Now you're getting, that's out of our purview.
Okay.
Representative Bonner.
Just for next time.
Sure.
The annotated text with the definitions.
Sure.
3.20, I note, adds the word hunt. When you talk about trapping, it means to hunt, take or attempt, take for burning animals, etc., with traps. And I'm just want to raise the issue that we've always talked about hunting, fishing, and trapping separately, and they have tended to have separate requirements. And this, I guess, just want to flag the question: are we beginning to meld or blur the line between hunting and trapping that has always been pretty distinct in the past? So like, for instance, with trapping, you have to have landowner permission; hunting, you don't. And now, and I'm just curious, what that actually adds to anything, if it's necessary or actually adds anything, and to the extent that it does, are we blurring the lines? I don't want to just flag that as something that we want to explore the next time.
Sure. I will say that it's been the department's position that trapping is a form of hunting. It has been our position for decades. We do distinguish between them because, there's always been maybe a higher level of concern about trapping than potentially, bow hunting or crossbow or using a gun. All of those are different methods from our perspective, but.
I guess I really want to understand why having that in there adds anything to what we're actually trying to accomplish, given the statute that asks you to do this work and then. So.
I don't think it substantively changes the rule. It just is more accurate. It more accurately, reflects our ongoing position on the fact that we believe that trapping is a form of hunting.
All set?
For now, yeah.
For now. All right, we're at time, and I want to say thank you to the council and members of the Department of Fish and Wildlife for being here and providing information to us, and we look forward to seeing your happy faces next meeting. And again, and my apologies again to this group, but we'll put you on the agenda for next time and tell us otherwise, okay? And next meeting, we only have one other rule. It'll be a long rule. So I'm suspecting that we'll start this conversation at 10:15 on the 19th. Okay.
I just thought that Mr. Scott's presentation of best management practices gave us a chance to actually see what the examples. So,
That was the point. It's hard to visualize it on paper.
Okay.
we hear the words, we don't often know what.
This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.